Yes. That one? Yeah, no, it's the funny thing is that. Not even due. Oh, yeah. Well, it was due to time, but I was not mine.
We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our February 16th, 2023 PBAC monthly meeting. What was that?
Should we do an audio check?
Yes, we should. Let's see. Anyone in virtual world, can you hear me talking? So I don't have to repeat myself.
Yep, can hear you.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Patrick. I have definitely gone halfway through the introductions before until I realized that we weren't live. So I appreciate the suggestion. So we're going to go ahead and kick off. Let's get started with introductions. I like to start in person. Let's start with Saline today because I always forget you.
Yeah, Saline Record, Executive Director for PBAC.
Jeff Lanigan, WC Facility Services.
Lana Cohen, U of I, filling in for Tim Link.
Mark Story, Whitman County Public Works.
Paul Kimmel, Lake County Representative. Tyler Palmer, current PBAC Vice Chair and City of Moscow Representative.
Ivy McCall, City of Pullman Representative.
Kara Haley, City of Pullman, current chair. Let's jump over.
Jean Elliott, community member. Robin Nimmer, Health Science and Engineering.
David Hall, Ladell County resident.
All right. Let's move to the virtual world. I'm just gonna go in the order that I see. Let's start with Aya.
Hi, I'm Aya Sumner, a Latah County Moscow community member, and I'm doing a leadership Moscow project on water conservation, so I thought I'd hop in.
Awesome. Good to see you here, Aya. Brooke.
Yes, no.
There we go. Hi, I'm Brooke. I'm from Nez Perce Tribe Water Resources, Water Rights Specialist.
Awesome. Glad to have you here today, Brooke. Let's jump to Steve.
Water resources.
Steve Robichon, can you hear me?
Yep.
PBAC Technical Advisor.
All right. Always good to see you, Steve. Kristen.
That's where she's at.
Hi, I'm Kristen Reisenauer with the City of Pullman.
I think she's with the tribe. Yeah. she's with the tribe.
Holt.
Yeah.
Holt Shelton with JUB Engineers.
We have Allison.
It's the next thing that goes mark.
Maybe she hasn't stepped away. She's with the tribe as well. Kyle. Oh, Kyle, you're muted, but we can see you. Maybe. Okay, we can't hear you, but we have Kyle with Alta. Oh, there he goes.
I was trying to use my phone for the audio because my microphone on my computer isn't great. But yeah, Kyle Duckett here with Alta.
Right, hi Kyle. We can actually hear you pretty well. So, Chris.
Chris Beard, Washington State Department of Ecology Water Resources Program.
Mike Parker.
Yes, Michael Parker with the City of Moscow.
Right. And I don't think we have Patrick.
Been there.
Yeah.
Yep, I'm Patrick is here. Patrick Cabbage, Washington State Department of Ecology.
Well, welcome everybody. This is a great group to have today. We might be almost equal in person and online. Let's go ahead and move into approval of minutes from our January 19th, 2023 meeting. Those were provided in the packet.
I move to approve.
Okay, so a second. Okay, moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Hi.
Any opposed? Okay. Motion carries. Our next is public comment for items not on the agenda. So I would open that up to anyone in the room, anyone online. Yeah.
There's been some coverage about the possible biodiesel project in Pullman. It looks like it'll be using quite a huge amount of water, so I don't know what's coming down on that, but
Yeah, I know there's a lot around it. I don't personally have a ton of
We'll just
information.
make a comment real quick that Eileen had to step out just for ex parte communication, just in case
Mhm.
the matter gets back to council. But past that.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add on it, but we can certainly take note of it and PBAC can keep it in
1,000
mind.
gallons a day or something or other. So
When there's opportunities to comment or decide at that time.
just something to be aware of.
Premature right now.
Yep. Okay.
Is Tyler grabbing Eileen?
I think he may be. Any other comments? And we'll get folks back. Let's move on to unfinished business. Kyle, do you have something?
No, I think I'm just gonna mute you, Kyle, because we're echoing.
Okay. We don't have any unfinished business, so we'll move past that item and we're gonna move into our new business. The first one is a thank you to Jeff Lanigan for agreeing to be our technical committee chair.
So far, that's been a huge.
I know you've had to do so much, but there will come a time where you change that statement, I'm sure. So we just wanted to make that known to the rest of the committee. Thanks, Jeff, again, for agreeing to do that. Our next item is Genesee well chip samples. And I don't know, Saline, if you have anything to preface on that before we pass it off to Kyle.
No, just, we've talked about this for a few meetings, but just in case folks have been gone or just to get everyone on the same page that, Genesee, drilled a well a couple months ago and there was some chips. And so they collected the chip samples and we want to get those analyzed. And so Kyle from Alta is going to present that scope of work that was in your packet today. So Kyle, floor is yours. But you're still muted.
Well, we muted you earlier when you didn't know it. There you go.
Still can't hear you.
I think the bad mic is striking.
I know, and I jinxed us because I said it was working so well. Yeah.
How about now?
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Okay. All right. So let me know if I'm breaking up at all. Again, it's kind of hit or miss on the microphone. Sometimes it's a little drony. I'm not sure why the phone mic's not working here, but so again, as Celine mentioned, I just want to kind of present the scope of work and cost estimate that she included in the agenda. Those drillers chips she mentioned, kind of the idea here is to kind of log those chips. I've already kind of went through them and kind of looked at what we have to work with as far as the chips. I've caught up with Dustin and Genesee Public Works, and he was able to shed some more information on the chips. But essentially, in summary, what we're going to look to do is dig into the chips a little bit, use some of John Bush's recommendations along with what I uncover when I start logging the chips themselves, and we're gonna kind of set aside around 10 subsamples from these drillers chips to submit for XRF analysis at WSU. And this is work that's been done historically on drillers chips from other wells. One of the things that I thought was really cool when reaching out to the lab, they've kind of expanded this line of research a bit, and they have some grad students at WSU who are doing some really cool work. And I guess in summary here, they now have a machine learning model at WSU which can do a lot of this for us, or at least expedite it and in turn pass those savings on to PBAC. So WSU is willing to analyze the samples at a research rate as opposed to a commercial rate, and they'll run the samples through the machine learning model for free, included with the cost of the analysis. So I'll log the samples, pick out a good subset of samples for analysis based on what I find in John Bush's recommendation. WSU will do the XRF analysis to provide geochemistry, whole rock geochemistry on the driller's chips, and then run that through their machine learning model that they put together there. So kind of the end result of that will be likely basalt members for each of our samples. So is it Grand Ronde, is it Wanapum, etc. And we'll be able to tie that back to Moscow Pullman and make the connections between the geology we have over here in our basin versus what we're seeing over there in Genesee. So that's kind of in short, that's the summary of the work there. So splitting it up into phases again. The first step will be to log the lithology and prepare the samples. Get that over to the lab and scheduled for analysis, and then work with the lab techs over there to understand their machine learning results and glean everything I can from the machine learning model. With that, it'll be kind of diving into the results, making sure it fits the conceptual model, making sure that the results make sense, and then kind of diving in anywhere as necessary where if it doesn't match the conceptual model, or if it doesn't fit with kind of our preconceived ideas of where the units kind of should be or where we think they are. After I analyze the data, come to some of our conclusions. It'll be drafting up the report and getting that into a report that is comprehensive but succinct and not it has everything that we need, but short and concise and easy to reference and easy to build off of as we move forward and talk about getting a data logger over in that well, and then some of the connections we might be able to make based on water levels and on what we see over time. That last task I threw on there as kind of a feeler. As always, when working with PBAC, I want to know kind of what you guys want to see in a deliverable and what would, make this work, what would it enhance the utility for PBAC. And one of the things I thought might be nice, just as a really quick, easy visual, is just making a fence diagram. So basically what that would do is compare the geology at depth in our Moscow-Pullman Basin with the geology at depth in Genesee. So it would be kind of a side-by-side down the well casing, what geology you encounter at depth. And if you're unfamiliar with fence diagrams, after we get out of here today, just Google fence diagram, and it'll kind of, you'll get a quick idea of what I'm talking about here. It would be a visual, a quick visual of how the geology compares at depth between our basin and this Genesee well.
Awesome. Questions for Kyle?
Madam
Discussion? Yes.
Hey Kyle, were you at the Tuesday evening meeting in Genesee?
I was not. Is that you, Paul?
Yeah, it's Paul. Okay, no, I didn't make it, so I was just curious if maybe you went or somebody else went. It was just kind of a community update on their water situation in the well. So do you know how deep that is? Wasn't it somewhere around the 800-foot level?
Yeah, Paul. So the chips go to 820.
820.
Talking to Dustin, he was thinking that it stopped at 813. So again, I'm hoping to catch up with Ryan at Mountain Waterworks a little bit more. I've left a message for him and just waiting to hear back from him. But yeah, it sounds like just over 800 feet, Paul.
Okay, thanks. And then have you had any conversations about putting a monitor in that well?
I have not. So talking to Saline, we definitely wanted to get the ball rolling with this geochem analysis, but I think we're still waiting on the prospect of the data logger.
Okay.
Yeah, and Kyle, I'll update everyone. Steve Robichon and I had a meeting with Dustin at Genesee and Ryan at Mountain Waterworks, and it sounds like Genesee wants to share data rather than have PBAC have their own separate transducer be placed there. So sounds like they're going to be doing that within the next, I don't know, Steve, month or so, right? And then we can work out how they share that data. We've said, how we get data from a variety of sources in a variety of ways, and just hoping that we can get something consistent every month is better than nothing.
But it sounds promising that the collaboration, they're interested.
They Genesee was not sure what PBAC was. They thought maybe we were like some crazy environmental group or something. So I said, I'm happy to come to Genesee and talk through what PBAC is and show you to the website and everything. So we'll see if we get that off of it. But Steve, did you want to add anything with the chip samples or the transducer?
Yeah, I guess when you said it'd be about a month, I think a month is really optimistic. It'll probably be quite a while. They're still working on the initial design of the earthwork and stuff for the pump house, and they'll have to put the pump house in and do all that. But in the background, they'll be working with figuring out how they're going to design the data collection system. But basically, they're not going to do it on the cheap. They're going to use a good high quality electronic transducer and a programmable controller up on the surface to gather the data. So what I was kind of concerned with was the prospect of them doing what's called a bubbler and a bicycle tire pump like they used to do in the old days to figure out what the water levels were, but they're going to do it well, and they're going to be able to collect the data at frequencies that we can use. And it seems like Dustin, their maintenance guy, is on the ball well enough that he'll be able to provide the data to us in a format that we're going to be able to use without a lot of prodding. So I think it's going to probably work out to be a pretty good situation.
Awesome. That can't be where you're really at, because you're not around snow, are you?
Yeah, that happened yesterday.
Really?
I'll be darned.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
You're
surprise
not
me.
Steve, are you sporting a tan there? What the heck?
Well, you see that background is the sunroom. So even when it's cold and snowy outside, it gets nice and warm in there. So I go get in my chair and just sit in the sun and bake inside.
I have a quick question. I don't know if it's for Steve or Kyle, or two questions. So it sounds like it's cool that it sounds like there's some involvement with WSU. Any fee, I was a little unsure, any fee that they need is already incorporated into this. And then my other question is John Bush going to be involved with this in any way? And do we need to think about some sort of reimbursement to him? I don't know. That's more of a question for PBAC, but Steve might know.
I think Kyle's the guy for the
Yeah.
geology. So
Okay. Well, I mean, we're not
Yeah,
asking John to do anything in this that, you know, he's already kind of helped lay out what needs to be done, it sounds like, and Kyle can work with WSU. I guess I just want to make sure we're not leaving anybody out in any way.
Yeah, I think I can take a crack at both of those questions. So WSU, their fees are already included in that. So under that analytical phase, part of that is my time in working with the lab tech and scheduling the lab assignment. Making sure that we get everything from them in the lab deliverable that we need. And then the other part of that is their analytical fee. So that's included. And then as far as John goes, I've been emailing back and forth with John. He's provided his recommendations on sample intervals, and we've kind of went back and forth on it a few emails now. I think John, from talking to him, it sounds like he'd like to be kind of in an advisor role. I think if I reached out to him with any questions or, wanted to pick his brain, I think he'd be responsive or receptive to that. But as far as, working him into the scope, we have not done that. So.
And that's okay. That answers my question. It was just,
okay.
Always want to be cognizant of John Bush's time, I guess, is the way to put that. But I think the proposal. Do you have a timeline on it?
I'm not sure how quick they could turn the analytical around, but I think that'll be the biggest thing. And then, kind of synthesizing and drafting a report, in a couple weeks or a month. So hopefully a pretty quick turnaround here.
Okay. And Saline, if it's something the committee wants to move forward with, this is something we would want to act on today. Are there questions? Are we thinking research?
Yeah, so I was thinking, I guess, couple things, Kyle, sorry. Let me share my screen so everyone at home. Kyle included this task 6, the fence diagram. So we need to decide if PBAC wants to do that. And then gave us a cost estimate for all 6 tasks. I would propose this come out of research and then maybe put a ceiling at $7,000 in case things can take a little longer, or we have to do a little bit more analyzation with the lab or whatnot, so then we don't have to come back every month for that. So a not to exceed limit.
Okay. Discussion amongst the group.
I think it's money well spent.
Okay, I'm seeing lots of head nods. Anything online? Anyone want to chime in? Okay.
Yeah, I think the fence diagram is the linchpin.
Oh, I think it's helpful.
Yeah.
Images.
Yeah.
Displays are really helpful in conveying or not conveying, or basically conveying what we think is happening. I would take a motion if we want to move forward on this.
I think we already have one.
We do?
I said, I moved that we approve.
Oh, I second. I should go home. All right, moved and seconded. I'll open it up for any discussion, but guessing I'm not gonna see
Does
any.
that motion include the ceiling of 7,000 that's all
Yeah,
you
it's
suggested?
$7,000.
Okay, fair enough. Excellent.
Okay. All those in favor?
Any
Any opposed? Okay, motion has passed to move forward with this work with Alta up to $7,000. I also agree, money well spent.
This was called out in the research area, correct?
Yes, yep, thank you, good clarification, Rusty. Well, great, thank you, Kyle. Thanks for the discussion, everybody. Let's move on to presentation and discussions. Our first item is an update in regards to the Alta extension contract. I'll hand it over to Saline.
So last month, we just mentioned gave an update on Alta's other contracts, not to confuse the one we just did. The committee approved $50,000 back in August to help with outreach and engagement and whatnot. And so next steps, we have about half of that left, a little under half of that. And Jacobs, the sub-consultant with Alta, is going to create like the prioritization kind of roadmap, if you will, for implementing alternative 5. So that's underway. We do have that contract being extended at City of Moscow because that's how we're paying Alta, because I think it ends March 1st, and
That's right.
don't think we're gonna get that done in 2 weeks. So that'll get extended just to, what did we say, May 31st, I think?
That's already gone to Public Works Finance Committee. It's going on a consent agenda to City Council next Tuesday.
It's just a time extension.
And it'll be a time extension through May.
Yep. So that's where that is, and hopefully we'll see. What we plan to do is get a kind of a final rough draft to the technical committee to be able to talk through that. So you will
Prioritize.
to make sure we talk in detail about, if there's any gaps that we see in that prioritization list, and then get it back to the committee. And we don't necessarily need to adopt it, but that'll be the rest of Alta's contract at that point. So.
Yeah, the hope is it'll be a little bit of a roadmap for next steps, the way I like to think of it.
Yeah, influence.
Or potential
future
next steps, I guess.
RFP or whatnot. So anyways, contract is being extended with City of Moscow for that timeline, and just gotta wait.
Questions on that? Any hands up? Okay, let's move on to our next presentation discussion item, which has to do with all the wonderful graphics that have been done by Fuse. I'm gonna hand it over to Saline again.
Yeah, so the committee approved $9,000 for infographics with Fuse. And in your packet was, I'd say, the final rough draft. There's only a few final tweaks that I've seen, just, grammar or, kind of placement of fonts or text and whatnot, but just wanted to give the committee at large an opportunity to see this and provide any feedback. The communication subcommittee has been able to see this a couple times, and so they've given their feedback as well. So just in summary, we have a full page graphic on the Palouse Basin Aquifer System. So it goes over the cross section and kind of the water cycle of the basin. There's another full page graphic of what we're calling the Palouse Basin Water Project, and it highlights alternative 5, which we are going to call Paradise South Forks Direct Use. And then there's 4 half-page graphics for the other alternatives, 1 through 4. And each one kind of just gives a really quick snapshot of text of what that project element is doing. And then there's these great little icons just for imagery, for, storage or aquifer recharge or direct use and whatnot. So past that, we do have an opportunity to do slight tweaks. Paul, do you want to add anything else?
No.
Before we open it?
Yeah, and my understanding is that we'll be able to pull different pieces off of these flyers and use images and graphics and things is my
Yeah, they'll give
understanding.
us a asset package is what
So
they've called
the
it.
PowerPoint.
So then we'll have, you know, images,
Plop some of these
these
in.
little icons, the surface water aquifer kind of diagram here. Plus the basin boundary and this water cycle image, all that kind of stuff. It's separate graphics, so we can use it in PowerPoints on the website, flyers, you name it, kind of a deal. So that'll be nice to have some cohesive, polished imagery.
I think they look really great too. And there, a lot of vetting went into these already, a lot of nuances and things, but. Go ahead. You have a comment?
I think it looks great. I have 3 editorial comments. I don't know.
Maybe if you wanna,
Now or.
maybe send an email to Saline, and we can at least consider them.
Yeah, I have a couple of little tweaks, just word choice things. Yeah, I'll send them to you. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to work through it, as long as we don't have anything like, you got the alternative wrong.
You or.
Saline.
Yeah.
Send them to Saline.
Yeah, Saline or pbac@uidaho.edu. That would work just fine. Just right to the main email would be perfect.
Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we're trying to get this
Wrapped up.
the comments back to the consultant tomorrow, or Monday, well, I guess not Monday, Tuesday.
Yeah, so maybe the request would be by the end of the week if you have something
Yep.
to share.
And do.
And, you know, Saline's done a really good job of. It's hard to land on something when you've got lots of opinions, and I think we've struck a really good balance of things. We picked it, the communications committee picked a lot of things apart, right? That you don't, yep. That are hard to know without having been there. But they turned out really well, so.
Any comments from the virtual world?
Yeah, questions online, comments online? Did we?
Madam Chair, just Lena, if you talked with Tim, no, thanks again for
Yeah,
making that connection with Fuse.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great.
Yeah, these
that's a
look
great
great.
find.
Yeah.
I think it's really accurate to the basin, and it's just, it strikes so really people can understand it.
Outcome. I thought they did a very good job. I think it really helps reach a lot of our target audiences. It makes it clear and digestible and makes the alternatives far more explainable.
Yeah, I already pulled one of these out to hand to somebody because they wanted to know, is my well in the same puddle? And I love that word puddle. And I've been using it. They go, is my well, I live outside of town. Is my well in the same puddle as everybody else's well? The answer, of course, is yes. But now I have a nice picture of the puddle. I realized it's a draft,
Nice
but I went and
picture.
handed it to them and they went, oh, okay. So, yeah, the puddle. It looks really good.
Okay, our next presentation is from our technical advisor, Steve, and it's a presentation of our 2022 pumping numbers. And I'll preface it by saying I always enjoy a Steve presentation. And it's always great to see the results from the previous year. So we'll hand it over.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
We can.
And can you see this? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, I apologize in advance because sometimes I tend to put too many numeric details into things. So if that turns you off, maybe now's a good time to catch up on your napping for the weekend.
Nuggies.
Fish joke,
Back to the
Steve.
first slide.
Yeah, where's the
Is there a
water
big
jug?
deal?
Our toilet.
We need a water jug before we start.
He's struggling.
He confused it. He's ignoring.
I was so confused, I wasn't paying attention. Am I supposed to be doing something other than what I'm doing right now?
We just wanted a water jug, Steve, but go ahead.
Oh, water joke. No, the one I have is too related to restroom usage, and that's probably not proper thing to be putting on a university public meeting, so I'll just keep that to myself. I'll let you know sometime offline about that one.
We are recording.
Sounds smart.
Okay, let's get started. And it's of course not working. Let me.
Oh, yeah, I guess something.
There we go.
Yep,
Okay.
you're good.
Okay, 2022 pumping, total 2.28 billion gallons. That's 6.3% less than in 2021. The pie chart shows how it breaks out in terms of quantities by entity. It pretty much matches up with kind of the populations, but then we have the complications of the university. Most of the students live in one of the towns. And Palouse actually pumps a little bit above their population weight. So that number is a little higher than their representative population. If you compare the number to 1992, it's 17% less than 1992. And everybody knows that's when the groundwater management plan came into effect. So since 1992, pumping's gone down 17%. How does this break out as a percentage of the total? You can see Pullman pumps the most at 41%, followed by Moscow at 32%. Again, this pretty much tracks with population. And you go down to Palouse, 3% of the pumping, but they have probably only between 1 and 2% of the population. This is how the pumping in 2022 breaks down by entity compared to 2021. Palouse was up 6% last year. And on the other end of the scale, Moscow was down 10%. You can see how the others fall in between those two numbers. For all of these bar charts like this, the red bars represent more pumping than normal, or drier than normal, or warmer than normal. So think of warm as red and cool and watery as blue. This is how it compares to the 5-year trailing average. And one of the things that I think people are starting to come up to speed with is, the weather changes kind of drastically year to year. And it turns out 2021 and 2022 were kind of a good example of that. So when you just compare to the previous year, you can really throw yourself off if you don't consider what the weather differences were between the 2 years. So a 5-year average tends to at least smooth out the weather changes year to year a little better than just comparing to the last year. So that's, again, how the entities pan out according to the 5-year average. And then here we go against 1992. And you see that down at the low end of the scale, UI domestic is down 68% from what they pumped in 1992. And a lot of that has to do with their process water and recycling the water that they use in their labs instead of just pouring it down the drain. Pullman's up 10%, but their population is up quite a bit since 1992 also. So, it's kind of what you would expect to see. But with the exception of Pullman, who has grown their population more than anyone else, everyone is pumping less than they were, over 30 years ago, or this would have been 30 years ago. Okay, this is one of the ones that gets kind of busier with all the numbers. The orange graph, or the orange line, is last year's pumping. And so the 2022 pumping is this one down in the lower right-hand corner. The blue line with the yellow dots, that's the 5-year trailing average. So what that does is it takes 5 years prior to the current year and averages that up. Okay. When you look at pumping, you need to say, well, compared to what? And so compared to what really does make a difference. So if I compare to 2021, you can see that it's down 6% from 2021. But you can see for some reason 2021 was quite a bit higher than 2020. We have this little dip in here, which is probably a COVID dip. But a lot of this is also weather. And you folks who lived through last year in the last spring up there probably remember that the spring was really wet and cold. And if you can remember all the way back to 2021, you'll remember that the spring was warm and dry. And so when you compare to 2021, you're really throwing the weather into the mix. And unless you consider that, you're going to come up with some issues. And so I think of comparing to the previous year as, what have you done for me lately? Okay. You can compare it to the 1992 number. You go way over here to the other end of the scale. And I think of that as, look how good we've done, right? And it really is a good amount of pumping reduction. But when you look across the country, in a lot of places, pumping has gone down in the last 30 years. And a lot of that has to do with technology. A lot of it's conservation, but a lot of it's technology. So the technology has really improved. People have been aware about water being a critical resource. So the combination of that in many cities across the nation have caused the pumping to go down over the same amount of time. If you look at the 5-year trailing average, which would be this number right here in the kind of yellow orange, you see that we're down 3% from the 5-year trailing average. So basically it was a good year in pumping. If you figure the 5 previous years kind of averaged out the weather extremes. And it really turns out that the 5-year trailing average is what was intended in the groundwater management plan. So that was what the groundwater management plan stated as their 1% increase target, was 1% increase from that 5-year average. This breaks it out as kind of a stacked bar chart. And this illustrates that the pumping was kind of constant, went up for a while in the 90s, but then has kind of been gradually but steadily proceeding downward since then. So it plateaued and it's been going down since the early 2000s, pretty consistent. And here it gives you another idea of kind of the percentage of the pumping. The purple bars on top are Palouse, the city of Palouse. So even though I present large percentage change numbers for Palouse, that's really not large absolute gallons percentage changes. So a 10% change in Palouse's pumping doesn't really make as much as difference as like a 1 or a 2% change into the Pullman and Moscow pumping. These are the targets that PBAC has been measuring against since 1992. And I'll talk a little bit more about this 1% target in a minute. But you can see that with the exception of 1994, the aggregate pumping of the 4 big pumpers, Palouse isn't a member of PBAC, so they're not in this one, has only exceeded this 1% target 1 year out of the last 30 years. And it's never gotten close to the 125% target. So even though these targets were there and the cities have been meeting those targets all along, the targets really don't have much meaning anymore. We're so far away from the targets that it's like everybody in the class is going to get an A and all of my kids are above average and all of that, right? It's just the targets don't work as well as we might like. This is how these individual entity targets break out over that same period. And you can see it's kind of the same story with a couple exceptions. Pullman last year in 2021, not 2022, but in 2021, for the first year in their history, they went over the 125% target. So when you think about the groundwater management plan having been written, hoping to have the solution in place within about 20 years, and now it's been 30 years, and Pullman has only exceeded the ceiling target once, really that's not such a terrible thing. And then this past year, 2022, they were back underneath that ceiling. Moscow was above this 125% ceiling and the 1% ceiling quite a bit in the 90s. But then in the early 2000s, when they really started cracking down on conservation, you can see that their pumping went down pretty drastically, and it's been down ever since. And they haven't really threatened either of those targets since the mid 2010s. WSU and UI, of course, have always been under both of the targets, and UI has been under so far that you could fit probably 3 times UI's current pumping under what this incorrect 1% target would expect you to meet. Okay, here's a side trip. And for me, side trips sometimes get into the weeds. So this is going to be kind of a weedy one for some folks. We go back to this aggregate pumping and the 1% and the 125% targets. And this is what the groundwater management said the 1% target should be. So what they said was the annual pumping increase. So that means each year, the pumping increase for next year should be equal to 1% of the pumping volume based on the moving average. Okay. So what PBAC has been reporting all these years is they took the 1% of the 1986 to 1991 average, and they just kept adding that 1%, that same number on every year, and said, well, the target's going to go up that same amount every year. But really what the groundwater management plan expected you to do was each year calculate that moving average, which is this blue line, and then take 1% of that average add it to our current pumping and say, this is what our target is for next year. So all these years, for 30 years, that's really kind of been a bogus target. And I've been kind of pointing this out to folks along the way, but you know, both of these targets really are based upon a groundwater model that was flawed. And so this is why I say it's in the weeds. Targets don't really matter. They're not tied to a model that's really valid. So it doesn't matter. But at some point, I think the committee needs to talk about targeting the future and how they want to try to limit their pumping in the future or not, depending upon what our current understanding is. Okay, so if I look at what maybe could be, this is what a 1% moving average target would look like. Instead of that steady inclined plane of the 1% line, this is what the 1% moving average target should have looked like, according to the groundwater management plan. And you can see that the pumping fell underneath that 1% target a significant amount of the time, but there were years during the last 30 when the pumping was over the target, right? And so that would have been a more effective and more meaningful target to be shooting for every year than that one that keeps going further and further away from reality, which is what the way it's been reported before was. The incorrect target would have said the target for next year is 3.41 billion gallons. Really, what the groundwater management plan envisioned would have given us a target of 2.24 billion gallons next year. So you can see that's over 1 billion gallons of slack that's been kind of misreported all this time. Okay, what might be a potential target going forward? I've been thinking about this a little bit, and the discussions that are associated with this alternative supply study. And I make some assumptions like you're going to adopt that 15% increased conservation part of alternative number 5. And if you assume that that's not going to be, okay, next year we're going to start this and we're going to get all 15% in 1 year. But if you assume that you implement it at 1% per year, which is pretty conservative, that ought to be something that's attainable. You can make that assumption going forward. And then you can make the assumption that the population is going to grow at about 1% per year, which is a reasonable assumption because that's what, on average, the population growth has been for the last 30 years, a little bit over 1%. So if you implement, or if you use these two assumptions, what should happen is the water demand should pretty much stay constant. You have 1% more people living here every year, but there's 1% more conservation for everybody that lives here. So everybody's more efficient at how they use the water, but there's just more everybody's around using it more efficiently. And your demand should stay pretty much constant. So the way that you can implement that in a target going forward is a 0% moving average target. Okay, you don't want to compare yourself just to last year because the weather's going to get you half the time and the weather's going to let you off the hook half the time. So if you use that 5-year moving average and say we want the increase to be 0% of the 5-year moving average target, or basically we want to stay at the 5-year moving average. That's what your targets would look like. And you can see that the 2023 target then would be here. This is the 2022 pumping. So you have some room in this 2022 to 2023 area, but that's because 2022 was less than this 5-year moving average. So you did good last year, but the average is still higher. So your target gives you some slack for the next year. So that's the kind of thing I would think you might have discussions about moving forward if you're going to talk about targets and how do we measure if we're meeting our targets. You might use that 0% moving average. That would come pencil out to 2.27 billion gallons next year. Okay, off of the side road now, back to how the pumping breaks down by month. You can see that most months are, between 5 and 7% of the total. But in the summer months, you get some pretty heavy pumping. Here you can see last year between June and September, it was 50% of the total pumping happening during those 4 months. If you look in 2021 and you just kind of can look at June and July, you can see that in June of 2022, 7% of the total was pumped, 2021, 12% of the total. And again, in July, 15% in 2021, and 13.7% in 2022. So here we have 2021, which was warm and dry, 2022, which is cool and wet. So you can see the weather really made a difference in this case between 2021 and 2022. This is by month, all entities, all 5 entities, including Palouse, how each month compared 2022 to 2021. Pumping was up early in the year from 2021, and this may somehow be a little bit of a remnant of COVID, I'm not sure. But you can see during May, June, and July, the pumping was pretty significantly down in 2022. So the cool wets hit the pumping during these times. And then in the fall, again, it was a little bit higher this past year than in 2021. So, okay, so that's the pumping. How did the weather look? This is a couple of charts from the airport. The top chart is temperature. And in this chart, the green band is the normal for every day. The normal high is at the top of the green band and the normal low is at the bottom of the green band. The extreme high pinks or reds are the record highs for that date, and the blues are the record lows. The dark blue is the actual highs and lows for every day of the year. Okay, the bottom chart is precipitation over the year, and this is daily precipitation out at the airport. The light green is what it normally is, or the average precipitation at the airport, and the dark green is what actually happened in 2022. Okay, so when you look at these two charts, you see a lot of the dark blues are over the top of the light blues, which means it was cool. It was cool, or you might say cold, during April, May, and June of 2022. And there's a lot more daylight showing here, like it didn't get as warm as it should. It's below normal many, many days. So those were cool months. You can see that in June, there was a lot of precipitation right here compared to normal. This would be the normal slope of the precipitation, and this is really steep slope. Then you go out later in the year and you see in August, September, the end of July, a lot of these blues are up in the red zones. It was warmer than average up there. So cool, wet spring, a little bit warm in the later summer. This is a chart from the Moscow Parker Farm, the plant science farm. This has by month a dot for every year since 1893. So this has data all the way back to 1893. The larger red circles are the precipitation in 2022. The green circles are 2021. And so the thing you can really see that stands out here is in June of 2022, there was record precipitation way up here, way above all of those other years, all the way back to 1893. And in 2021, it was actually below average. So there was a big difference in precipitation in June, and also a pretty big difference in May. You know, in April, the precipitation might bother you, but people aren't really using water outside that much. So this doesn't really have as much of an impact on the pumping. It just has an impact on the stream flow and kind of bothering you because it's raining outside or snowing outside all the time. Okay, here we go for another side trip. This is a chart I've developed that shows what's called precipitation deficit. And what this does is it estimates how much water it takes to ideally grow an acre of turf grass. Okay, and there's research data that shows how much data, depending upon where you're at, what type of climate you have, how much pumping it takes, how much water it takes to ideally grow turf grass. And you can get an average value, and I'm using the average value from 2006 to 2016 because that's what I have data for. And then I use evaporation data from the plant science farm to estimate how things compared in any individual year to that average. So in 2021, if you look back in 2021 during the irrigation season, April through September, and a lot of people might quibble about April being irrigation season. That's kind of a standard irrigation season across reporting. In April, for example, you had to apply 59,000 extra gallons for every acre of turf grass to give it as much water as it needed. In June, you needed to apply 78,000 gallons for every acre of turf grass to give it what it needed. If you go into 2022, You see, all these bars are blue up until August. So what this says is you really didn't need to put any irrigation on your turf grass until August of 2022. It was so wet and so moist that the grass really didn't need to get watered because there should have been enough water in the soil profile for that grass to do fine until August. So you can compare these 2 years to each other, and you can see that in 2021, it took 255,000 gallons for every acre of turf grass to keep that grass growing just like you'd like it to grow. In 2022, there was extra water. You really, except for August, didn't need to put any water on there. If you look at the difference in pumping between 2021 and 2022, that was 154 million gallons. And if you look at the pumping difference just between April and September, it was 212 million gallons. So in 2021, 212 million gallons more water was pumped than in 2022. If you assume that like 75% of this April through September pumping extra was associated with grass, turf grass, that's about 160 million gallons. And I would think this is probably a pretty conservative estimate because it may be more than 75% of that water is going to grass. But I assume there are trees and swimming pools and things like that that use water outdoors that aren't associated with the grass. So you take that 159 million gallons and you divide that by how much water it takes to grow grass, you come up with about 490 acres of irrigated turf around the basin that's using that water to keep that grass nice and green. And for comparison, I think the WSU golf course is about 100 irrigated acres. So if you pull the WSU golf course out of that, there's about 400 acres or so of irrigated turf grass around these towns and around the basin that are using the groundwater every summer. Okay, since I've given you all those numbers, make sure everybody's still paying attention. I'm going to do pop quiz. It should be easy, just to make sure you're paying attention. What's that right there? Anybody?
Yeah. A hobby horse.
A hobby horse. Very good. Some people remember those things. I assume they're too dangerous now for children. So that's a hobby horse. Okay, everyone passed that because one gets it right, we all get it right. That's the way it works. Here's the second pop quiz. What is this?
A waste of water.
Well, could be, but remember the answer to the last one.
It's in my neighborhood.
Here's the answer. Hobby farm. So really, what's happening is we have 400 acres of hobby farm out there. People spending time, energy, and money farming turf grass. And they're not selling it as a producer would sell their crop to anyone. They're throwing it away. So they're basically 400 acres of hobby farms. And that accounts for most of the pumping that occurs above the average in the summer. And that's also really close to what we now think would be the amount of water it would take to stabilize the lower aquifer.
I've got a nerdy question.
Okay.
Like I said, this is my hobby horse for sure. When you say how much water turf grass needs, is there a definition of need? Is it an aesthetic consideration? Is it sort of a gut feeling, or what do they mean by need? Does it want to look like that photo that you just showed, or?
I'm not sure exactly what the definition is, but the definition I think has to do with there is always enough water available to the blades of grass to grow as much as they possibly can, given the inputs from sun to maximize the evapotranspiration. So to continue to grow until the biological processes take over and the sunlight isn't enough to do the photosynthesis. So I think of the word thrive. It's enough for your grass to thrive. But I don't think there's a photo that you can take that says, yeah, it should grow to be 3 feet deep or something like that if you mow it. But I think keeping your yard nice and green generally takes, in our area, about 3 acre feet of water for every acre. Of 3 acre feet of water for every acre. And so that's, around 100,000 gallons. Per
It strikes
acre.
me that there's a lot of variables there, though. I'm with you, Eileen. I mean, between lush and alive and dormant and dead, there's that whole spectrum, and then there's a variety of grasses you can have and the respective amount of water it takes to keep them alive.
But if we're selling a conservation method, we need to sort of have all of our terminology well understood, at least amongst our group. So, yeah, because somebody like my neighbor, she wants it 6 inches deep and lush green, no matter what. And so that's kind of one standard, so anyway, that's kind of one of those.
Yeah, of course, it's gonna vary on the year too. You
Yeah.
said 3 acre feet of water for every 3 acre feet of water for every acre of lawn. Was that per summer or per month? I know it's gonna vary on the weather, but.
Well, that's seasonal. That's
Season.
that's for the
For
season.
season,
It takes
okay.
3 acre feet to do it. And I know this is a bad time to bring this up because of the last week's Super Bowl, but thriving grass has to do with root depth and the amount of evapotranspiration and photosynthesis that can occur. So when your yard looks okay, but not as good as your neighbor's yard, maybe it's because your neighbor put too much fertilizer on there and zoomed things up too much, but maybe it's because some percentage of your grass is not thriving. So you might have 20 blades of grass and 8 of them are not really thriving. They're starved. And so they can't do the photosynthesis. So they're not as green and as bright as their adjacent ones because their roots have access to all the water. But I think the way you would think about it is if you were going to grow this grass commercially and sell it to stadium in Phoenix for the next Super Bowl, thriving is grass that really works well in the Super Bowl, has nice deep roots, it's nice and green and everybody likes it, and it's not coming up in chunks or too wet, too dry. But yeah, that's a good point, Eileen. It's hard to physically describe it.
3 acre feet per acre, is that what the number?
Per
That's
season.
the number, and that comes from when I used to do water ice examining. They have climate zones that they define, and within a climate zone, depending upon what crop you're growing, they'll specify how much water you should be able to use to grow that crop ideally. And what they use for turf grass in our area is 3 acre feet per acre. Now, it turns out that the finer pencil sharpened number for the Moscow area is like 28 inches, not 3 feet, but 28 inches. So it's close to 3 acre feet, but 3 acre feet's the good rule of thumb to use because that's what applies in our area according to the state.
If I use your 100 acres for the WCU golf course, that's half as much as we put half as much water at that on the golf. That'd be about 100 million and we put 45.
Look at that.
So
Ooh, like that.
it plays faster too, I hear.
Patrick, you had your hand up and you were chiming in on this conversation.
Yeah, I have a question for Steve and then a question for PBAC members, and I'm not sure if this is the right time for both of those. I was just going to point out Chris Beard pointed out that 1 acre foot is about 325,000 gallons. So 3 acre feet is about 1 million gallons of water. Just doing the math there. But my question for the entities is, do the cities have a program to monitor soil moisture and then, have an adaptive irrigation program for city properties? And then the follow-up question is, do the entities have a program for communicating kind of adaptive irrigation to residents as well?
Patrick, I can fill that for you for Moscow. We do have some city facilities on a smart irrigation system, and we have a plan for the transition for all of our facilities to a smart irrigation system. And yes, that is part of our outreach and education. It includes education on appropriate watering and how to transition to smart systems. And we have some free devices that help move toward that as well.
The WCU answer is that our system is fully automated and automatically compensates it for evapotranspiration rates and that kind of whiz bang stuff. So yes, it's all centrally controlled. So there's
I think Pullman's more in the intermediate piece. I know in the last several years, we've had quite a bit of studies that made recommendations. Some of them have been made, some of them haven't. So it continues to be a work in progress. But yeah, certainly.
No, I appreciate that. And I assume there was some level of that just based on the pumping numbers going down, you know, the way that they had from a dry year to a wet year. So thank you. I appreciate that. The question I had off for Steve was, mostly just out of my own curiosity, have you looked at the daily per capita water use and how that's changed over time?
I've been looking at per capita stuff. Per capita is really difficult because we have issues with universities and cities reporting their pumping independently, and we have students that live on campus and in the cities, and we have cross commuters. But the per capita use has gone down. If you just take the total pumping and divide it by the total population, it has gone down, and we track that. I've been working on kind of behind the scenes, coming up with an indoor residential per capita use number that can be compared to standards across the country, because it turns out that California is really pushing on indoor conservation and indoor residential use. And they've, by statute, developed some numbers. And so if we can work our way on the Palouse into being able to figure out how much is being used indoor residentially, then we'll be able to compare ourselves to the California standard and say, hey, we're doing pretty good, or really we're not doing very good. How much room do we have to improve? Where should we focus our efforts? So there's progress that can be made indoors. There's progress that can be made outdoors. But at some point, the low-hanging fruit on the indoor things, like the old toilets and stuff, those start to go by the wayside. And it's a lot more expensive to save a gallon of water indoors than it is to save a gallon of water in your turf grass. So I'm hoping that as we move forward and this 15% conservation thing gets implemented, I'm really hoping that there'll be some type of a group that sits down and talks about these details and how they're going to monitor and measure how they're doing compared to what is possible.
Okay. Thank you. No, thanks.
We're also going to form a committee that just goes around and ridicules people with green grass, Steve. Green grass ridicule committee.
Well, we're gonna buy Tyler a special enforcement car. He's gonna drive around.
That sounds really exciting. Yeah, it's good to hear. Good to hear, Tyler.
All right, Patrick, you're on that committee. Come on out, buddy.
Perfect. Hey, thanks, guys.
Okay, back to Steve. It looks like you have another side trip.
Okay, I'm getting tired of these side trips.
This is really the fourth one because we took you on a side trip, I think.
Okay, this side trip involves looking at things a little bit differently. This is data from the Snowtail site up on the top of Moscow Mountain. And they have sensors up there that record precipitation, snow depth, and what's called the snow water equivalent. And most of the time when we think about precipitation, we think about what happens in the winter, which you can see when things are precipitating, that's the winter. In the summer, it's really not precipitating. So when we talk about the weather, really the weather doesn't really have anything to do with precipitation. But now that we're talking about things that are not just groundwater based, when we're talking about supplemental surface water, we need to think about how much precipitation is occurring and how it's leaving or whether it's leaving the basin. So what's happening early in the water year is going to start becoming more important, or we just kind of neglected this because we didn't really know that it was important and we weren't using the surface water. So this is going to be more important. So you can see that this is at Moscow Mountains, Snowtail. The red is 2022, and then the 5 previous years are different colors. And I can't see out to the right of my screen, but I think it might show that that says 48 inches. Does that say that?
We have to move your head.
Okay. I don't know how to move my head either.
About 48 inches, yeah.
Okay, well, it's 48 inches. And if you remember the airport, the precipitation out at the airport in 2022 was 24 inches. So there's twice as much precipitation on top of Moscow Mountain than there is at the airport. A lot more precipitation. We're now learning, thanks to research that Kyle and others have done during the last decade, that a lot of the water that recharges into the system is coming off that mountain front. So it depends upon how it comes off the mountain front, how much of that's going to be able to recharge. If it all runs off really quickly into the streams and out of the basin, it's not going to recharge as much as if it's stored as snow and it gradually melts and trickles into the aquifer wherever possible and then runs off. So we're going to have to start paying attention to what's going on up on top of Moscow Mountain in terms of snow accumulation, because that's basically a frozen reservoir up there. And in terms of what's going on in terms of runoff, because if we're going to use the streams as supplemental supply, we need to be paying attention to what's in those streams. So here's the snow depth chart, and this one basically just bounces a signal off the snow. And if the signal comes back to the transmitter really quickly, that means the snow is deep because it had to go not very far to bounce off and come back. If it takes longer, the snow is shallower. So that's how that works. You can see in 2022, the snow was getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper until about the middle of January. And then something happened and you can see the snow is not as deep anymore. So it's either getting denser and more packed, or it's starting to melt and run off. So precipitation that was coming in after the middle of January wasn't really cold, snowy precipitation. It was probably rain or rain snow or more sleet. And so in that case, you don't have as much snow, you don't have as much storage in your snow reservoir compared to these previous years where the snow depth continued to build up throughout the spring until it finally warmed up and started to melt off. So years where you get warm temperatures and warm precipitation, you're not going to be storing that water in the snowpack as much. And that's one of the things that is projected to happen for climate change is the precipitation in the transition zones, which is what we're in, is going to be warmer and warmer. So what used to be snow predominantly might now be rain predominantly. And it doesn't take very many degrees of change for things to transition that way. And we happen to be in a zone where that's going to be especially important. And it's also especially hard to model. And so Tim Link isn't here, but Tim is pretty up to speed on this stuff. And I think that he's right on board with the latest research that we're going to be able to get to see what's really happening in an area like us in terms of how much storage we're getting in our snowpack. Okay, this is the snow water equivalent, which is saying if I took all the snow and I melted it, how much water would that make? So a really light, fluffy snow, it might take 20 inches of snow to make 1 inch of water. But if you get a really wet, dense snow, it might take only 4 or 5 inches of snow to make 1 inch of water. So it depends upon how fluffy that snow is, how dense it is. And you can see that, you know, things were going along pretty well again until January. And then the snow water equivalent last year didn't really increase. So the water wasn't getting stored in the snow to make it more dense. It was actually running off. So from that chart, we can kind of guess that we had early runoff last year compared to previous years. It wasn't getting stored in the snow and it wasn't making the snow more dense. So it was probably just running off. So now if we can go down to the stream gauge at Paradise Creek out there at the, I think of it as the Winco traffic light. I don't know what you want to call it, Farm Road Perimeter Drive traffic light. This is the instantaneous discharge at the Paradise Creek gauge. And you can see that beginning in the water year, which starts in October, you get these peaks, which are high runoff periods associated with precipitation or very quick temperature changes where you get very rapid snow melt and runoff. But most of this times, this is a precipitation associated runoff. A lot of peaks. Peaks, as everybody knows who've walked next to Paradise Creek or South Fork or any of these things, peaks are pretty much brown, muddy peaks. They're not nice crystal clear peaks in this area because they're carrying a lot of energy. There's a lot of sediment in the water. And so they're really kind of brown and muddy. If you look at this 2022 year and behind in the light gray, we see 2021. And you can see what's happening here is we have precipitation events and runoff. But in 2021, what we're seeing here is a dry spring, right? And we're not even getting the precipitation. So what we're seeing here is just snowmelt runoff, where in 2022, we had that wet spring and we kept getting these precipitation events. So the stream flow kept up nice and high, kind of muddy, but nice and high. And eventually precipitation tails off and you see the runoff and the groundwater recession coming in here. And in the fall, it'll pick up again and you see these high peaks. Looks like you had a pretty big gully washer going on and probably rain on top of snow towards the end of last year when you had the flooding event. And this is like 800 and some CFS. So this is a lot of stream flow at Paradise Creek back at the end of December. I think it's alternative 5 that one of the estimates said we would like to take 5 CFS of water out of Paradise Creek in the months between January and April. So I think alternative 5 is trying to be able to get this much supplemental water out of Paradise Creek during these 4 months. And you can see that some years there's going to be an issue with that. Like in 2021, not only would you have pumped the stream dry, you couldn't even have pumped 5 CFS out of that river without making it go dry. And every year, even there are low points where you can't get the 5 CFS out of there. And then in other cases, you've got these peaks, and it may turn out that these high flow times are so muddy and so turbid that it's going to be extremely expensive to treat the water. You're going to need pre-sedimentation basins followed by sedimentation basins before you even put the water in the filters and the treatment. And when you get into the economics of the water treatment of this really turbid water, you may find that it's going to be really expensive to treat the water, and it might be worth just letting that water flow down the stream because you can't afford to treat it. It's just costing too much. So when you look at that and you start saying, well, in an ideal world, we could take 5 CFS out, but we're not in an ideal world. So maybe some years there's not going to be enough water in that stream to take out to get that 5 CFS. And maybe in other years, or maybe in the same year, the water's just going to be too turbid to treat. And so instead of having this estimate that says we've got 4 good months of 5 CFS, you look and see what's left. You might not really have the amount of supply that you expected. And since the cost of estimates for this alternative involved how much water you were going to be able to get out of it, you may need to sharpen the pencil on those cost estimates. And that's one of the things that I recommend that the follow-up, the roadmap that Kara was talking about does, is evaluate just how easy it's going to be to treat this water and how frequently we're going to be able to get the amount of water that we estimated in our kind of high-level estimate. So those are a couple of recommendations going forward for what maybe the roadmap would call for. Okay, I hope that's my last side trip.
Hey, Steve,
This is one other thing I didn't add. Some years, like last year, you can see that there's water available in Paradise Creek way out until June, right? So shutting it off in April just because that's what we decided we're going to do may not make sense some years. There may be extra water available that we can use all the way out into later in the spring and maybe even early summer in some years.
Question, Paul?
Hey, Steve, Paul here. Are you pulling this from the Northwest River Forecast Center site?
USGS.
This is from the USGS. They're the ones that run that page.
Okay, yeah, there's a newer site. I was at a emergency management meeting with Robin Fox from NOAA, or National Weather Service, and she was talking about a Northwest River Forecast Center and a website that has a lot of the same information. So I think they're pulling USGS gauge data. So I'm not sure, but because I saw these same charts.
Yeah, I go out to the, you can go out on the internet and look at the USGS real-time data. And I think the city of Moscow uses that when they do their flood predictions and things too, but they don't look at the flow. They look at the gauge height because that's kind of what's important in terms of flood is how high the water is.
And Steve, on the South Fork, the gauge is over in Pullman, right?
It's at Pine Street, right under the bridge.
Right under the
By
bridge,
Thomas
Pine Street.
Hammer, but Paradise Creek's interesting. Because they'll give you live data. The South Fork USGS will actually predict a forecast. They don't do that for Paradise Creek. So they'll actually predict out prior to a storm. So it's interesting if people are interested in that. When it's a rainy period, take a peek at it. You'll see they'll predict a peak. Sometimes it comes close, sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down, but it's interesting.
Thanks, Steve.
Question over here?
Your concept of increased population, well, increased conservation will compensate for increased population to a point. But obviously there's at some point where the population would surpass what's totally realistic in minimal water usage. How far out, or do you have any time or numbers where that compensation is no longer possible?
Well, the assumptions that I made were that the 15% conservation would be implemented 1% each year for 15 years. And if the growth is 1% for 15 years, then the demand would stay constant for 15 years. But in year 16, enough new people would move in that the demand would go up. So that would basically give folks 15 years to find that supplemental water and implement it. And we need not only the supplemental water for the extra people that are moving in, but we need to take pressure off the aquifer. So we need the aquifer stabilization amount to allow the pumping reduction to let the water level stabilize. So we need that now, and we will always need that, but we can keep demand in check for 15 years if we can implement the conservation at 1% per year.
Thank you.
Do you have anything on the chat? We need to, real quick. Just a comment from Chris Beard. Another method to measure stormwater or snow water equivalent is a snow pillow, which basically weighs the snow and converts it to inches of water.
I think that's what they have on this come out.
Is a snow pillow.
Yeah, they do. They have the pillow.
Oh, and then Tom says NOAA is now making predictions for Paradise Creek.
Yeah, they do.
Oh, I didn't know that, but it doesn't seem to show on the gauge on
They
USGS,
don't show
does
on the
it?
gauge.
Okay, but they're
yeah,
predicting probably after
They'll
the
predict peaks and they'll communicate that to us.
the 2019 flood.
We take, well, no, going back further than that, we have a site where we take snow water equivalent totals that we have, they've set up a portal for us to submit that data. So the city does that, and then they'll use that data to.
I know they forecast like
saturation
flood watch or flood.
They'll
Levels.
actually,
Thank you, warning watch.
they'll actually forecast peak flows and hours and time course.
That's cool, okay. Huh, but they don't make that available on the
I
web.
haven't seen it on the website.
Okay, that's interesting
I
because
think it's on this Northwest River forecast.
I'll have to look into that, because Missouri Flat Creek, I feel like we don't have a gauge on it, but it's similar size, and I feel like it responds similarly to Paradise Creek. At least it did in 2019, so some of our protocols are to actually check the Paradise Creek gauge when looking at Missouri Flat Creek and kind of correlate it, sort of.
Yeah, it's
kind of.
not available. I don't know if it's on the site or not, but we certainly.
Okay,
can
good to know. Steve, you want to continue? Sorry, we got on a
Yeah,
tangent.
I think I'm close to done here. Water levels. I talked about water levels last month, so I'll just touch on them this month. This is Pullman well number 3. It used to be a production well, but water levels were getting low enough and that well is shallow enough that they quit pumping a few years back. But we still have a logger in there. And if I do a linear regression on the water levels back to 1990, if I do it by decade, you see between 1990 and 2000, it was going down a little over a foot a year. 2000 to 2010, it's down to 0.88 feet per year. 2010 to 2020, it's 0.71 feet per year. Now, I haven't really run the regression in this period. We have some COVID issues that are going to probably make that be a little bit lower. But we have another issue I'll hit on at the very end that would make it be a little bit higher. So I would expect it's in the vicinity of 0.7 foot a year right now. In the upper aquifer, back in 2017 in the summer, Moscow cut back from their pumping out of the upper aquifer, and they're the only major producer that pumps out of the upper aquifer. And as soon as they pulled back from their pumping, you can see that the upper aquifer, at least in the Moscow area, is recovering. So it's coming back nice and smoothly, multiple feet per year. Now, Tyler's reported last month or two that the plan is to start pumping the upper aquifer again at find some sustainable levels. So I would expect that this nice smooth curve hopefully would get kind of like a recession soft landing and flatten out at some point where we get a sustainable level, because that aquifer can be pumped sustainably. It's just been being pumped a little bit more than it can sustain in the past.
Yeah, Steve, we'll get some good data this spring on that. Well 6 is down as a well house is being rebuilt. So well 3 is being pumped currently and has been for the last several months. And so we're really looking forward to seeing how that responds with that pumping. And so we'll get some good data this spring on that.
Okay. And in addition, I can go back into this. I've talked about this before, but the Moscow pumping areas in the upper aquifer are kind of separate from the upper aquifer out by the University of Idaho. And so there may actually be water out there that's available too, but that's a whole nother discussion for another time. Okay, so this is good that the water levels are recovering when it's not being pumped. That's good, but this is a chart that shows Moscow's pumping from the upper aquifer tailing off, but they had to get that water that they weren't pumping from the upper aquifer, and sure enough, they had to go to the lower aquifer to get it. So Moscow's pumping from the lower aquifer has gone up. And so the lower aquifer pumping has gone up in the vicinity of 200 million gallons a year. At the same time, the upper aquifer pumping has gone down by that amount. So that regression line that has been getting flatter and flatter may have a tendency to get a little steeper when this extra 200 million gallons a year is being pulled out of the lower aquifer. And we won't be able to really determine that until we've got a few more years worth of data in and get COVID out of the system and all that. But the lesson, of course, is the water's got to come from somewhere. If it's not the lower aquifer, it's the upper aquifer or stream water. I mean, we can't make the water out of the air. We're not good enough at that. So that's all. I'll leave that at that.
Discussion, questions? I think it'll be interesting, Tyler, to see what your data shows. And, there's probably opportunities to find that stabilization and maybe in the summer and in time that'll allow to be a little smarter. So questions for Steve? Steve, really interesting as always, informative. Even the side notes, side tracks, whatever we want to call them. Questions?
Great stuff, Steve. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Agreed. Okay. Well, let's move on to our last presentation discussion item, which we have listed here, and we've titled it Interagency Agreement and Bylaws Updates. And I'm going to hand it over to Celine.
Yeah, so this will be really quick. It's just to get the gears started, which after a presentation of Steve's, I'm not gonna, there's a lot of gears there. And so I don't know if I'm gonna be running the same gears or different gears. Anyways, I'll stop with the gear analogy. But so I would like to start talking about discussing some of our documents that govern PBAC. The first one being the interagency agreement, and the second being bylaws, and then the groundwater management plan. Depending on the level of updates and things like that, it could occur within the next 6 months to year or so. So I'll just briefly go through the updates that I've seen that need to change and just with our discussion these last few months. But the purpose for the interagency agreement was to bring all of our member entities together to work jointly and cooperatively on water resource problems and issues. And it includes, you know, who the members are, the governance, the financing structure, you know, if people want to leave PBAC and things like that. So as far as members go, City of Palouse, we always have them in the data, but they're not officially in PBAC, and we've talked about bringing them into PBAC. And so I think having those conversations with Palouse and officially bringing them in, figuring out how they have a seat at the table with fees or number of members and all of that kind of thing. Right now, it's evenly split, 2 cities, 2 counties, 2 universities. So how do we bring in Palouse? And then potentially how do we bring in Genesee if that is a connectivity later down the road? So, and then as ex officio member, then as First Tribe, I think would be a good member to have. Especially as we get further down the path of bringing in these or implementing these alternatives, making sure that they're always at the table, even in an ex officio capacity, I think is better than just always having a courtesy kind of invitation out. I think we need to bring them at the table officially. I know there's people from the tribe on this call, so FYI, we're thinking about that. We need to have those conversations with you. But then also the contribution fees. So historically, there's an admin fee and a research fee. The major pumpers, the cities and the universities have a higher fee than the counties, just because of the municipal systems and the population there. And then there's the research contributions, which again are from the major pumpers. So the admin fees right now are $27,000 for the major pumpers, and then $6,750 for the counties. And then the research fees are $20,000 for the major pumpers. Now we've kind of gotten just a lot of discussions about admin fees and research involvement and where money should come from different entities. So my proposal would just be to restructure it and just call it a PBAC contribution and not split it down the middle of admin versus research. Of course, we'd still create a budget every year that says we spend this % on salary and this % on research, and we want to save this much for research and things like that. But to itemize it out individually per fee, I think needs to be the way of the past, especially as we maybe go down more of a technical applied research, if you will, instead of actual, like, you know, academic research. So that would be one proposal that I would make. The other one, of course, would be to increase the contribution rate. We haven't had those increases in quite some time, but with a full-time employee, and that puts some strain on the administrative budget if it continues to be structured the way it is. And then, you know, the technical costs for implementation, whether it be data gap finding or hiring consultants to do some of that data gap or things like that. There's a balance there. You know, hopefully we would request money from the states or get grants, or the cities would fund some of these options. So it doesn't mean that PBAC is going to be asking for $100,000 each year from each entity to make this thing happen, but there does need to be a balance there. And if we want to keep that forward momentum going, only getting $60,000 each year is not going to be a lot of buying power when some of these projects cost $200,000 to $300,000. And, you know, we want to, as Steve has pointed out, you know, we've had this plan since 1992. We're starting about conservation, like we need to start building that track if we want to go down it. And so the budget committee is starting to have these conversations, and the increase wouldn't be slated until FY probably 25, ideally 24, but it depends on how those conversations go.
The last one was in 19. We said
19
for the
admin.
Yeah, the research fee hasn't changed.
The research fee hasn't changed since it's like year after it was implemented.
But the admin, it used to be, yeah.
It was 20,000,
Yeah.
then it was raised to 25, and then it jumped to
27.5.
27.5 and 19.
As far as the bylaws, you know, that's just how we conduct affairs, that's memberships, officers, voting, meeting protocols, things like that. So as far as the bylaw updates, we would want to include to allow email voting, just if people can't make it, especially in this virtual world. We'd have to put pretty good parameters and sideboards on that, but we want to include that in the bylaws. Clarify that board members would have that board seat for 2 years, just to have a little bit more consistency instead of just a 1-year term. And then I propose to expand the board. So right now we have chair and vice chair, but I think having chair, vice chair, and then past chair and chair elect, just to always have kind of a cycle through, and some consistency, over the years would be good too. Again, I'm not proposing any language. I just kind of want to throw some of these out there to let the gears turn. Again, maybe too many gears turning
These are just
today.
a lot of things that Eileen has noticed and familiarizing herself, and they're all valid points and things to at least consider.
Yeah. And then lastly, the groundwater management plan, which Steve touched on. And that includes, our history, our authority, the basin characteristics, the member entity plans and goals. And again, we would want to include Palouse on that, but then review and update our entity action plans and the target numbers. And hopefully that would be in conjunction with the regional conservation plan. So that's a bigger lift, and certainly a document that would be a lot more sensitive to update, just because that is something that the states both agreed upon years ago. So, but those are the updates that I've seen that we probably need to have happen. No action, just some thought processes.
Things to
there,
think about.
Things to think about. Any comments or
Questions
feedback?
from anyone? Anyone hear any of those and think, eek, or yeah? Or
I think there's some things to discuss there, in terms of other, if we start talking to Palouse, I think it needs to be more of a broad conversation about any municipality, municipal water system within the basin should be given a mechanism to have some sort of
say
seat at the table.
if they were interested.
Yeah, and on the budget front, I think we also need to talk about at what point is it appropriate for, there's a point at which one of the alternatives becomes a project and therefore has a different funding mechanism, and a different kind of probably cost sharing scheme. So I think we need to think through how that takes place and where the two would diverge.
Yeah, I think you hit on that one of my bigger, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, we were kind of the same.
One of my bigger, I guess, things that I've been chewing on and thinking about, and that we've talked about some, is that, yeah, when that transitions to a project, it won't be a project owned by PBAC. And so at that point, I think there'll certainly be a role for having a continued mechanism for collaboration and cooperation, but
What is that role?
It looks
What does
different
it
at that
take?
point. And so
Yeah.
I think thinking about that transition is a wise thing for us to do.
Yeah, but continuing, I guess, just stepping back 1 second. My opinion too would be that does need to be sorted out. PBAC can still, that monitoring piece is going to be important, and the consistency of collecting the data. So, I mean, it's the goals of PBAC, like what are the goals and what are the priorities? And it will adapt, I think, as hopefully projects get implemented. But my hope would be that PBAC would still be there in some role. It's just defining what that role is.
Yeah, well, this isn't a forever solution, and we've seen how long it takes to get something off the ground here. So I would never envision a cessation of cooperation between the entities on monitoring, on water supply, on that sort of thing. It's just structured potentially differently for a period of time.
Yeah, and it's probably not shocking to anybody with inflation and everything, a discussion around, increases. Seems like some discussions with the budget committee were kind of maybe on a 5-year timeline, that sort of thing. But all the entities have different mechanisms in which they would do that. So there's still a lot of discussion around that, rather than maybe a set increase every year or returning every 5 years or whatever. So other questions? Anyone online have a question? Comment? We do have about 20 minutes left.
And we don't have any subcommittee reports today, but there was in the packet just a monthly budget update, so. I guess that ties into the conversation about fees and whatnot, but. Hopefully this is something that can be included in the packet just every month moving forward, just as expenses and revenues come in and out.
You want to touch on it briefly, or
I
maybe we don't have.
certainly can.
Just big picture.
Yep. So revenues, typically we get just a touch over 180,000, but we actually got some money back from City of Moscow for the funding for the intern that we didn't use it in full, so we're actually even more in the green this year technically. We have received all of our contribution fees or assessment fees in full, and they're all in the bank right now, except for the $20,000 from U of I for research. So that's good to see. As far as the research budget goes, most of the expenses have been to Alta and the data logger, which will be a yearly expense, and then that outreach extension. Even though Alta is still working on that contract was with City of Moscow, so we had to pay that out in full. So if there is any money left over, PBAC would receive it, but we had to give that all to Moscow right now. As far as admin or operations, events, that was like leadership roundtable, few office supplies that are as needed, couple different lunches that we've had during meetings, things like that over the year. And this is not just in the last month, this is from fiscal year start. Professional development conference I went to in November, and then the dues and memberships that PBAC is a part of. And then most of the expense has been just salary and benefits for myself and Steve.
And those get paid out at the beginning of the fiscal year, traditionally?
We transfer money into that account completely. The fiscal year completely, and so that is as of, I think, Monday or last Friday, how much we spent, but what's left over is this 54,000 that should be paying us through the rest of the fiscal year. So our balance right now for admin, our research budget, program budget, which not really, Corey didn't leave notes, so I'm not really sure what that was for. And then our compensation kind of salaries. Those are the balances that we have. So like I can go into the details, but I didn't put them in here. The admin budget is good for about 1.5 years, 2 years with the current rate that we're going. And the research budget's very healthy, but as soon as we do an RFP or something like that for an implementation, first, second, third step, that'll go pretty quickly. So I think it's a healthy balance right now. But that's today's story.
Okay. Questions for Saline on the brief budget report? I want to thank her for putting that together because it looks really nice. It's a nice addition to have. Okay. Yeah, I don't think we have any other subcommittee report updates. We have other reports and announcements.
Yeah, so on that note, I gave my notice earlier this week. I will be leaving PBAC. So of course I just gave you all these updates of what we should be doing, and I will not be here to be able to do that. So we're still working out timelines of if it's a 2-week or a 4-week notice. But I won't be going far, and I'm not moving or anything, so it's still going to be near and dear topic for me. But
yeah, with that, so we'll have a lot of things we of course have to figure out. I do want to propose to this group, at least I think a lot of these folks were around a year ago when we got Corey's notice, but we'll want to be pretty aggressive in trying to get somebody back in. So first I do want to thank Saline. I know it's been very short, but she's done a really wonderful job of diving in and not having a lot of guidance. And even in 6 months, I think she's accomplished a lot. So want to thank her for that. And she's given us some really good guidance and things to think about as well. But I wanted to pitch maybe a transition subcommittee again and see if anybody would be interested in joining on that. Yes, Paul, something to add.
I'm happy to serve on that as well.
Okay, WSU, UVI, counties, well, I guess we have LATA over here. Well, I guess we don't know exactly what that will look like, but we'll want to strategize a little bit. And, you know, I think the reason for the subcommittee is the greater committee only meets every month. So working through some of those logistics with a smaller group will be helpful. And then, of course, Rusty with U of I assume you get to sign yourself up. But I'd open it up to anyone else who has an interest in being involved with that. So Paul, Tyler, myself, Rusty, if someone else wants to be engaged with that process, please chime in.
You need me.
Okay. And maybe, I mean, we could even include you in some and what works and doesn't. You know, we'll have more updates for the group at the next meeting when we work through some of the logistics. And Saline's also, you know, lots of discussions around potentially her ability to help a little bit with the transition, but we just don't know how things are going to fully work out. So we'll be having more conversations. So thank you, everybody who agreed to sign up. And Mark will think about maybe including you in those two if it works.
Just gonna be a busy year.
No kidding, no kidding. So yeah, a little step back. It's going to be some work to get somebody in, and we're just going to have to be realistic about that, I think. But still do want to thank Saline for her work over the last 6 months. And she really has done a lot behind the scenes. And I think the person coming in will have a lot more stuff to go off of as a starting point. So questions, comments? Everyone is shocked? No, just kidding. I'm still in denial, but it's okay. We'll get over it. Yeah. Well, we'll move on to.
Yeah, so the next PBAC meeting is March 23rd, which is not the third Thursday of the month because of spring break. I figured we'd have low attendance, so we pushed it because there's 5 Thursdays in March.
This Thursday.
So just FYI of things that could be coming up at that meeting. Jeff Langman, not Lanigan, reached out.
I even could do that.
For well sampling with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Steve, please fill in because you were on that email with any other details that I may leave out, but they basically Jeff wants to come in, do a quick presentation to the major pumpers. So both universities, both cities, and talk about doing some well samples. And it would just be great to hit all 4 entities at once. So we want to make sure that you all are all here. Steve, do you have anything to add? Because that was pretty short and sweet.
Well, first of all, I'll add that Kyle's the man on this one too, but basically what they're doing is they read Kyle and Jeff's isotope work, a paper, and said, hey, we can go into this place and sample for some other things, and maybe we'll be able to tell a lot more about the age of the water. And it turns out this Woods Hole organization is a big time organization, and they don't come around and do projects just for fun. So it's kind of a feather in the cap for Kyle and Jeff that Woods Hole would have any interest in anything like this just based upon having read their paper. So I guess I'll let Kyle tell you a little more if he needs to.
I think that was pretty good, Steve. So they're going to come in and do a new dating method that kind of expands on the noble gases idea. But I don't want to spoil it for next month. So Jeff will give you the full rundown, and I'll add my name to the list of people who also confuse Jeff Lanigan with Jeff Langman when I see him. Right? But yeah, it's exciting stuff, and it's really cool that Jeff has been moving this forward. And, you know, hats off to him. Just, I don't know, really exciting stuff.
So from what I understood, Jeff just wants to make sure that the folks that are on the ground that they need to be able to access the wells are here at next month's meeting, or at least can give the sign off to get into those wells for next month's meeting. So we just want to make sure those major pumpers are here and represented and we get contacts shared. So that's on that, and then potentially conversations about a feasibility study for alternative one. Paul, do you want to?
Sure.
Maybe
So, yeah, again, as we
briefly,
mentioned in the Alta report, you know, if there's an opportunity to partner with the utility on getting that water lifted up to the Palouse, you know, pump storage is one potential renewable resource for a utility. So I'm having conversations internally what that might look like if we have interest in actually doing a feasibility study on a couple sites in the Avista footprint, including a Snake River. So more to follow. I'll have more concrete information proposal.
yeah. So just to see if PBAC wants to help out with that study, and if it's worthwhile. So hopefully have more conversation about that next month as well.
Yeah, we have a chat up there. I'm not sure what that, oh, maybe that might be
I think that
the
was
link.
Oh,
Oh,
Jeff is a rock
What's that?
star. Yeah.
both chats, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure, let's go
Speaking
with
of
that.
getting Jeff confused, don't send a Tyler Palmer an email at eli@edu. If you email Tyler and he doesn't get back, you may have messed that one up.
Facilities guys got a lot of money now. Tyler Palmer works in facilities.
All right. Yeah, I think we used up most of our meeting time. I'll open up one more time for comment. Otherwise, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right.
Hey.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we'll see you all next month.